Good evening, everyone. Howdy, howdy, howdy. Welcome to the EFF Austin meetup. My name is Stephen Torrance. I'm on the board of EFF Austin, and I'm our meetup coordinator. And this is the last meetup that I'll be coordinating. So you're witnessing a historical event. And speaking of history, we're here tonight. We're welcoming two guests from the University of Texas in various aspects. They're folks I'm familiar with through some work I've done here in Austin that is very loosely but oddly related to this. About 4 years ago, after volunteering with the Goodwill Computer Museum for a short time, a few of us left there to do some more intensive work in the realm of keeping vintage systems alive, and started a group called the Museum of Computer Culture. We've had some interesting successes as a nonprofit over a few years, but through my work there, not just keeping vintage computers running, which is something that I have a great passion for, but also using those vintage systems in service of keeping software alive, keeping our access to the code that we've created so much of over the last 30, 40 years accessible. And some of those environments are very, very important to keep running because there are emulators for them, and many other interesting technical things that our speakers will go into more detail on. So it's a piece, it's a facet of a much greater issue that we're seeing now, which is this deluge of stuff that our society is creating, not just ephemera like data and metadata, but just physical matter that we are putting together. And the process of keeping that around, the important bits of it that we may want to see later, at least generally, the field of archiving. But I'll leave it to our speakers to go into much more detail on that. Before we get started, we usually have announcements. And I'd like to open it up to any of y'all here. Interesting things that are going on in the general realm of the electronic frontier coming up in the near future. Meetups, talks.
Oh, I actually have one.
Parties. What you got, John?
Tomorrow at the Consumers Union office at 11:30, and that's at 7020 Easy Win Drive, Suite 250, which is upstairs. We're going to have a 501 Tech Club meeting, which the 501 Tech Club is sort of like nonprofit technology. The N10 is the larger sponsoring organization of these 501 meetings or clubs or local like instances, I guess, of N10. And I am going to give a talk about the future of the internet. And that's at 11:30 tomorrow. If you're wondering where Easy Win Drive is, we're upstairs from the Black Star Co-op.
AM.
No?
AM?
Yes, 11:30 a.m.
Okay. Otherwise, I mean.
11:30 p.m. would be more like, we're going to have a party and it's going to be kind of a rave.
Yeah. That's the future. I'd go to that.
Since I'm already talking, you want me to make my other announcement?
Sure. You got the talking stick, John.
So, I am going to speak for a second. My role as president of EFF Austin. And, you know, interestingly, Claire brought up the fact that they're about to have the 25th anniversary of EFF in San Francisco, and I had to look it up. I looked on the Well, where there's a huge repository of EFF-related information, because EFF was founded on the Well, which is an online community, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, that's been around for about 30 years. EFF was formed 25 years ago, and I found the exact date, July 10th of 1990. And sometime that same year, I think in March of that year, Steve Jackson Games in Austin was raided by the Secret Service, and Steve sued the Secret Service. That became the first big project issue case for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And I don't know how well you can see it, but if you look at this, you can see this is a October 22nd, 1992 issue of the Effector, which is the newsletter for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. It says here, EFF Austin, the first chapter. So we were supposed to be the first chapter of EFF. The fact that they didn't do chapters sort of changed that, but we've been here ever since. So we're almost 25 years old. And today we're like, it's 21st century EFF Austin. But we have some traditions, we have some things we've done. And the biggest tradition we have is try to engage people and involve people in doing digital freedom, cyber liberties kind of stuff. And one thing that we did in the past that we haven't done very much lately is focus on what we used to call cyber arts, digital arts. There was an EFF Austin Arts organization. So I told Stephen that I would sound the call. If anybody wants to get more involved with EFF Austin, volunteer, do stuff. If you've got a project in mind that you think would fit EFF Austin and you want to do it, talk to one of us, Greg Foster, John Ludkowski, and Stephen Torrance, who is here with us for a while longer.
A little bit longer. And actually, John, I'll segue off of that. That's actually how I got involved with EFF Austin. A little over a year ago, when I was still working with the Museum of Computer Culture, John and the organizers of the yearly party invited me to create a pop-up computer museum for that party. So I had no idea that EFF Austin was still doing anything, came at it from that vector and met a bunch of amazing people, had one of the best times of my life, and that really almost directly brought me to what I'm doing right now.
Yeah, a lot of what we've been doing is parties.
Yeah. so a lot of vectors.
When I mention arts, I'm not just saying, volunteer to do art stuff, but I just want to point out that that's something that we've done in the past, and it would make sense to do, and you don't always think about that in the EFF context. But anything that you might want to do that feels like a good fit, come to us and talk to us about it, because we're fired up now. We're really fired up. And we want to do more stuff.
Can I follow on that actually, and as a total interloper, and say this is not something that I want to work on, but it's something I read about, that there were chapters on the East Coast doing outreach in public libraries, doing training about how to do encryption, and through the public libraries, and I kind of talked about it at UT libraries just to a couple people, and it's maybe not a good fit for us programming-wise, but I think the public libraries might go for it, and I would totally come to that, and I think it would be awesome. So, if anybody wants to do that.
We had our surveillance self-defense workshop last year. Had a good turnout for that. I think there's going to be that. Yeah.
They're building a brand new central library downtown too. That'd
really?
Be a great way.
Yeah. And there are a lot of people doing kind of more interesting outreach stuff there now, so
cool.
It might be susceptible.
Well, I'm at the Austin Public Library, so I'm happy to.
This is what happens, y'all. This is what happens. Well, cool. Any other announcements before we get rolling here? All right. Well, with that, I will welcome Jennifer Hecker, our first speaker, to talk about Digital Archives quick like. It's all set for you. Here, let me switch it over.
Excellent. All right, so I'm going to attempt to read my notes off of this. It might get unwieldy and I'll just abandon it. But so this is going to be super quick introduction to the world of archives and digital archives. So forgive me as I just kind of steamroll through a whole lot of stuff. If I say anything that strikes your fancy, ask me questions and we'll talk about it more afterwards. But so first I wanted to talk about, this is how I got into archives. I heard someone tell this story and changed my mind from being a public librarian, which is also awesome, to getting into archives. And it's because I heard this story about Angelina Eberly and the Archives War, this statue you've probably seen down on Congress Avenue. And during the statehood period in Texas, Sam Houston really wanted to move the state capital to Houston. But there was another contingent who wanted to keep it here in Austin, and this is where the state archives were. The records of the state were here, and Sam Houston knew that in order to actually move the capital, what would have to happen is the records would have to be there. And so he came by cover of darkness and sent some guys to steal the archives and take them to Houston. And this woman, Angelina Everly, came out and shot a cannon off to rally the citizens of Austin to come out and save the archives. And they chased them down to like Bastrop, I think, and got the archives back. And here we are, right? Like, I don't know which direction. Anyway,
yeah, right.
It's out there. So the point of all that is that archives are super important because whoever has the information has the power, right? I don't need to tell you guys that. That's what we talk about all the time. So that's what made archives really appealing to me, was realizing that that it's really the records of our very democracy, but then also the records of all of our human creativity, et cetera, and we can't really do a lot as people without knowing what our past is. So this is what like an analog room full of archives looks like after some archivists have gone and put it in order. And that's what we do basically, is put stuff in order that we get so that people who are looking for answers to their questions can find their answers, right? Because this is what we get at the beginning, right? We have all these different types of things. We can have photos and film and magnetic tape and boxes of junk, and nobody wants to dig through that to find their answers. And now this is the kind of stuff that we have, right? Is all these different kinds of media, and we have to figure out how to do the same things that we were doing before, but with this stuff instead. So this is how archives look when we get them usually. Sometimes we get lucky and somebody has like something in order, but usually it comes in, it is in order, right? It's the order that the person had their stuff in, right? That's the facts.
There's some natural groupings up there.
Yeah, for real, right? These are bundled together actively by the person who made these records. This is the Guatemalan Police Archive, which was found like that, and now the UT, Benson,
Human Rights.
Yeah, the Human Rights Documentation Initiative helps like mirror this content now that it's been digitized. But anyway, sometimes that's what we get, right? But then, at least that, you can look at that and you can know some things pretty quickly. But with that, are those records on that thumb drive in any order? Or are they crumbly? Or, there's all kinds of new issues that this brings up for humans, right? So there's some fundamental things that we as archivists do, no matter if this stuff is analog or digital. And one of the things is appraisal, and that's we make decisions on what should be kept forever. Some stuff should be, some stuff maybe not so much, and it's different in every place you're talking about, right? So if it's the city council archives, maybe an envelope with a postmark on it, not a big deal. If it's Norman Mailer's papers, maybe that envelope with that postmark says a little bit more about his creative process or the people he was corresponding with that influenced his thinking, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a lot of different reasons that you would make a decision to keep something forever and ever. So that's part of our work. We're also really interested in provenance, which is where the thing has been, where it came from. Did that thing come from you who made it, and therefore it says something about you or your work? Or did it just like somebody, stuck it in your mailbox and you never even looked at it, but it ended up somehow in your archive? You need to know the difference between those things to be able to understand the information that they're giving you, right? So we keep track of where we get things from, and we try to keep track of their history and how they got to us. Obviously, we try to preserve stuff. Probably like the most stressful part of being an archivist is like laying awake in bed at night thinking like, did I make sure that everything's gonna last forever? Which is a lot of pressure, but we try to do our best, and we try to remember that really we just need to make things last like for another generation so that we can develop new exciting tools that the next generation can apply to make that stuff last again. So it's not as stressful as it sounds, but it's one of the biggest parts of our job. The other thing, I touched on this briefly, original order. We also try to make sure that the stuff that we get stays in the, we try to make sure it stays in the original order, which isn't normally possible. This is the first kind of tenet that falls apart, because a lot of times, like you saw that pile of stuff. What, am I gonna like leave it in a pile, you know, to reflect the fact that it had been in a pile once? Like, that's crazy. You wanna be able to find this stuff. So at a certain point, we do have to rearrange things, but we try to keep track of how things originally were. If nothing else, in like a narrative explanation, sometimes, if nothing else is possible. But sometimes, and with digital records, this is both harder and easier. Sometimes you can just keep it exactly how it was, you know, and let people look at it themselves. Especially, you know, you look at mid-20th century office records, and there was a secretary in there filing things in triplicate, and it's already filed under, you know, by subject and by author and all these different ways. And you can pretty much leave that and people can find what they're looking for because they had a really rigorous file system. So same thing goes for digital records. If somebody describes their stuff really well and keeps it in a really great order, then maybe you can just leave it. But normally we have to do a bunch of stuff to make it intelligible. For access, which is the other part, and preservation and access tend to be the big, you know, trade-off that we make, that we have to balance against each other. You want everybody to be able to see all this stuff, but you don't want it to be destroyed by grubby hands or by thieves or by digital alteration, all these different reasons. So we got to preserve things, but also provide access to them, and that's always something that we're like juggling back and forth. So that's kind of just the basic what archivists do. Here are some of the tools that you would use if you were performing archival operations on some analog material. So you would need to like take a staple out real careful. You would use that. You would need to, you know, measure the physical object. You would need to maybe keep some things together in a way that didn't put holes in the documents and destroy them. So those are some of the tools you might use. These are the tools that you might use for digital archives, right? So they do the same things. They, you know, keep the records intact and not destroyed. So there are a number of different things here that make sure that the record is the same way, right? Checksums, it's exactly, you can check and make sure that the record is exactly how it was when you got it. Normally with analog, you would just do that with your eyeballs, but so we have to use all these different tools, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of these in a minute. This is an awesome schematic that I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about, but this is the kind of thing you have to draw when you're trying to think about how to deal with digital records. And with physical, you can make piles of things. But yeah, there's all these different kind of phases that digital records go through, and a lot of them are a lot less final and a lot less certain than they are with physical records. A lot of times we don't get physical records until somebody dies or something. You know, they just sit in the closet and nobody stresses out about them because they're not going anywhere. But with digital stuff, a lot of times there's iterative editing, you know, all kinds of different revisiting stuff, reusing data in different ways that make kind of our interactions a lot more complex. There are some other challenges. Complex digital objects. It's easy enough to preserve something that's like a PDF, that's one page, but if that one page is part of a book or is a derivative, access copy of a better preservation copy for that book, all those relationships have to be maintained digitally so that you can understand how all those things are related. So in the analog world, you would put a bunch of documents in a folder together, yay. But here you have to maintain all of those, you know, relationships digitally, so that when you get very complex objects, that can be intense. And beyond it being, you know, things like books, there are 3D images, visualizations, video games, large data sets, simulations, architectural models, things like that, that all of the parts of those digital objects have to be kept intact. There's also some access challenges, right? And we talked about emulation a minute ago. That's one way that some of the access challenges are being solved. This is from Emory, where you can go to the archives there and you can look at Salman Rushdie's computer and play around in it, in his files. In the original software.
It's been scrubbed.
Has it really? Okay, good. I was gonna say Jessica's gonna jump in and correct me. Has it really?
Yeah.
Okay, can we talk about that in the Q&A? Because I bet there's some reasons.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
They had conversations with Rushdie about that.
Excellent. Yeah. So that's an option. Interestingly, a lot of our thinking about digital archives. We talk a lot about this OAIS model, which don't go to sleep. Which comes from NASA. This is something that NASA developed in the wake of the Challenger disaster as a way to track like parts and information in a standardized way so that everybody knew exactly what was being talked about. And it's a really interesting model, and we use it. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but we use it as a way to kind of track the progress of preserving digital objects. So there's an ingest kind of, and then a storage, and then like how you output access stuff to people. And so we use that to think about what we're doing. So some more challenges are being solved. Now I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that are being solved. One of them is, you don't want all your data to get lost because you had it in one place. So lots of copies keep stuff safe. And there are people talking about how to preserve digital stuff, and there are people doing digital preservation, both at a national scale. So I just wanted to bring up some of these. I'm not talking a lot about what's going on here or at my library, just kind of more of what's going on nationally and generally in the field. So there's the National Digital Stewardship Alliance that was out of the Library of Congress, but they're looking for a new home right now. And they do research and advocacy and training for archivists and librarians about digital preservation. And then there are a couple of different groups. These aren't the only two. I think there's another couple of them, but MetaArchive and DPN, which is something that UT Libraries, or that the University of Texas is involved in. And they're both kind of node-based replicating partnerships where material goes into each one of the nodes, and so then it's geographically dispersed, and if something terrible happens in one place, everybody's stuff is safe. So so that's one thing that folks are doing. There's also collaborative tool development that goes on to solve various problems that come up. So this is like a company, Artifactual, who produces a number of different digital archives tools, and they're just released this product called Binder in collaboration with MoMA that helps archivists be able to go through their archival data on the back end and kind of look through their stuff in a more granular way and be able to deal with all the data that they have on the back end. So let's see. Here's a project that, oh, that's terrible. Okay. Oh, that's even worse. Okay. Wow, that went crazy. Oh, no, maybe it's good on here. Oh, it's good on here. Okay, sorry. I was looking at my iPad. I apologize. I knew that was going to go bad somehow. Yay, all the images are here. So this is a little project that I just worked on recently. The EMOP project is actually out of A&M, and they've been working on some access stuff, which around training OCR engines to be able to read the early modern printing materials. And so things like this, which are, as you can see, kind of wonky and messy looking. But archives are full of stuff like this, and we don't have enough people to sit around and transcribe this stuff all day so that you can Google it, right? But that's the goal. That's what we would love to be able to do, is provide really great granular access to this stuff. So there are a lot of people working on different stuff around OCR, but this particular project they were working on being able to train Tesseract OCR engine to be able to read and understand this kind of stuff. And so they finished their project, their grant-funded project, and they're looking for more stuff to apply this to. And so we collaborated with my side project, this fanzine, Austin Fanzine Project, and we took these messy-looking fanzines, which are actually very similar and actually produced under similar circumstances, because a lot of those early modern printed things were vanity publications by very people who had access to printing. Then it was rich people with fanzines, not so much, but access. Anyway, so we ran those through the same workflow and ended up getting some really great OCR results that we can then have humans do correction on instead of actually typing all of the stuff out. So that's gonna be great. And so this is just kind of some of the kinds of work that can happen with digital archives material and digitized archives material, which is a fine distinction. There's also web archiving stuff. Y'all know about the Wayback Machine and the Internet Archive, but that doesn't normally keep the media that's behind the site. And so if you want to really archive your website, a lot of archives use Archive It, which is from them, but that saves everything, all the files that make up your site. And so that's something that I hear a lot of anxiety expressed about, that somebody should really be thinking about this. And so I like to talk about that people are thinking about it, because it's scary. It's really scary when people get a really visceral reaction when it occurs to them for the first time that nothing on the internet might be saved, and they're like, it's really, yeah. So it's happening. There's also all kinds of crowdsourcing stuff that can happen with helping archives, again, describe our material. And there are a lot of really good reasons. There are a number of projects out there around this. The Smithsonian Institution has a lot of different crowdsourcing projects that you can participate in. New York Public Libraries, a lot of different places do. Metadata Games is a place that pulls together a number of different kind of gamified crowdsourcing activities. And there are a lot of really great reasons that archives can pull the public in to help us describe our stuff, because we're not always experts in what the stuff is that we're dealing with. So usually we're able to describe it to a level that provides good access, but there are a lot of subcultures and communities that we're not part of that maybe have other words for things, and we do a pretty good job of this. But it's great to be able to pull in expertise from the community to help describe things, and also to be able to really engage with the material. So it can be really fun and engaging for the users also, and kind of build a little bit of engagement with archives, which isn't normally something that the general public gets, right? Like if you have a research question, you may be familiar with archives, but often other people aren't. So this is a cool way that you can get in there and get your feet wet. And then another question that we talk about a lot with digital archives is what to get rid of and what things maybe we shouldn't be archiving when it's so easy to just go out and take people's stuff and archive it. We don't do that generally, but with paper materials, it's, you have to physically transfer it, and it's a little easier to get permission and to have a conversation about that. And so, the right to be forgotten and things like that come up more in this digital realm. So that's pretty much it. I went really fast.
No, that's good.
Yeah. Jen works at the Briscoe Center for American History at UT, and she's going to talk real specifically about one thing, so that'll be different.
I know
she's doing
something not completely different.
awesome, really specific work around one of our major challenges.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. I'm happy to be here with you guys. I'm Jennifer. So as Jen said, I'm going to talk specifically about software preservation. It's one piece of this bigger issue of, or not issue, but just realm of digital archives. As you can see, I have my co-investigators here. Zach Vowell, my predecessor at the Briscoe Center for American History, the former Digital Archivist and UT Video Game Archivist, who's now at Cal Poly. And then Carlos Ovalle, who's actually on the advisory board for EFF Austin. So, in good company here. You don't have to know what this says. The purpose of this slide is really just to show you guys that the discourse around software preservation just within archives, forget more broadly, but just within archives has been going on for more than 30 years. It's not a new problem, but we're slowly evolving from dialogue to something more actionable, which is typically how things go. And so I'll just bring up a couple highlights from the early years, and I'll talk about the later stuff later in the presentation. But significantly, in 1984, as early as 1984, in the archival literature that I can find, there was a lady called Trudy Peterson, and she wrote about or explicitly acknowledged and articulated the performativity of digital documents as being a big issue, right? That's in 1984. And then also in the 80s, towards the end, around 1989, David Bierman, who's prolific and active in the world of cultural heritage and has published on DLib magazine, if any of you guys are familiar with that, which is an online publication. He was commissioned by the Computer History Museum, which at that time was in Boston as opposed to Mountain View, California, and also NARA, to do an investigation into the viability or feasibility of the National Software Archives. And something really important came out of that, which was, well, the answer is no, by the way, in 1989. But in terms of what was articulated, he sort of highlighted that software preservation, you can come at it from two different angles, and they're essentially opposite sides of the same coin. On the one hand, you can think about preserving software as preserving the means to retrieve and process historical machine-readable data. That's my interest, and that's SPN's interest, is we preserve software in service of our existing born digital collections. Does that make sense? So the other one is preserving software as information in itself, as a discrete cultural object on its own, right? And I think where you get a lot of that is in the conversation and language around video game preservation. So again, just to give you guys our position in this big ecosystem, we're really trying to push the conversation forward in terms of we need to preserve this stuff to preserve the stuff that we've already committed to preserving forever. Scary word. Okay, so then just to break this down really quickly, so software preservation network, software scoping is always an issue, so you gotta scope. And so for starters, we're looking at proprietary software because we see this as, I wouldn't call it harder than preserving the whole other world of software, but I would say if you look at the kind of born digital collection materials that we get, oftentimes they're in proprietary file formats. And they're only becoming more, increasingly, I should say, complex. So Jennifer brought up a good example, which is in modern architectural practice, people have CAD files. I mean, that's a really good example. And so those files, although there is some freeware out there that's also proprietary, just happens to be free, which are viewers for these complex digital objects, they can't always render all of the features of the proprietary and the specific version of the proprietary software that was used to create it. So in terms of preservation, what are we actually talking about? So Jen kind of covered the big space of tools that we use. She talked about checksums. But how do we actually get stuff off of original or legacy computer media, if there is computer media that we're talking about and it's not just like an FTP transfer? We do a disk image, so it's a bit-for-bit copy of whatever is on the media itself. So DD has been around for a super long time, classic Unix command. There's a more sophisticated version of that that does a checksum of the original installation media at the same time, called DDF-LCD. And then all of these tools, including the ones that are in BitCurator, are essentially, it's the same underlying open source digital forensics tools or Unix tools we've always had, but with a GUI. And then some extra like Nautilus scripts. So BitCurator is actually an Ubuntu it's a flavor of Ubuntu. Ubuntu is a flavor of Linux. But BitCurator is a distro that's basically Ubuntu, but it has all of these GUIs for open source digital forensics tools. Technical metadata is another important part of it, and I'll just say that, yeah, so Jen mentioned, so checksumming is part of both technical metadata more broadly, but specifically in reference to chain of custody. So when Jen was using the word provenance, in legal terms, that's what we're talking about. And then network. So network, that means a grouping of basically people, processes, and machines in this context. And more specifically, which I'll talk about later, this project is nested in an existing ecosystem, which we totally acknowledge and want to be a part of, because it would make no sense to reinvent the wheel in any of these areas. But we have what's called distributed digital preservation networks. So locks, lots of copies keep stuff safe. That's one instantiation of that idea, and another one is Deepin, which Jennifer also mentioned. Okay, so let's talk about the legal framework for software preservation as I know it. And I should say, full disclosure, I claim in no way to be any sort of legal expert. But in terms of libraries and archives, these are the pieces of that broader legal framework that we are the most familiar with and that we often operate in. So, okay, first thing, copyright for archival preservation. Section 104, first sale, limits the copyright holder's distribution right. So once I buy your copy of WordStar, I can loan it, or I can sell it, or I can give it away, right? Section 108. This is the fair use exemption. So it's the exemption for libraries and archives to make reproductions without obtaining permission from or providing compensation to the copyright holder. And then for the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the DMCA, Section 1201, this makes it illegal to circumvent technological protection. Don't copy that floppy. I don't know if you guys, yeah. So makes it illegal to circumvent a technological protection used to restrict access to or distribution of copyrighted material. And there are 6 classes of objects, I believe, that have been designated as being eligible for this exemption. And luckily for us, 2 of those have to do with computer programs. Distributed specifically in formats that have become obsolete. And this gets really tricky when we're now in the world of cloud-based subscription software or software as a service. So what are the challenges associated with these things? Okay, first of all, Section 108, fair use. Well, we qualify, SPN qualifies, archives more generally qualify for the fair use exemption, except for the part that says, quote, reproduction is meant to be isolated and unrelated. It should not result in the related or concerted reproduction of the same materials over a period of time. Neither should reproduction be systematic and serve as a substitute for a subscription to or purchase of the original work. And that's where it gets really dicey, because preservation is systematic. In terms of the DMCA 1201 rulemaking procedure, we have issues like, okay, the cycle's every 3 years. So even if you've received an exemption in the past, there's no guarantee that you'll get your exemption re-upped in the next cycle. So there's also, and you just have to provide that justification for the continued existence of your exemption every single time. But there are exemption explorations, I guess you could say. In 2003, Library of Congress allowed circumvention of technology protection measures for video games, again, when formats were obsolete, or the original hardware or media was necessary for access. And then currently, and this is posted on you guys' website, but this is also blowing up on like the academic games listserv, because there are a lot of institutions currently working on video game preservation specifically. But the EFF is currently advocating that the rulemaking procedure allow the circumvention of protection measures for the preservation of video games, but it's strongly opposed by the Entertainment Software Association. And so that's problematic insofar as part of what SFN is trying to propose is starting a dialogue, or maybe figuring out what dialogue has already happened that failed and where can we pick up the pieces and kind of put them back together again. But the crux of the legal challenge, I think, goes back to this notion of first sale. Because no one institution can possibly own, purchase, find at this point all of the software titles that we would need to read all of our existing proprietary file formats in all of our collections, in all of our repositories on our campus. There's just no way. So yeah, that's a problem, and that's kind of like the first step in that broader process where it relates to Section 108. So yeah, it's big. Also, to go back to the cloud-based subscription software, software as a service, there's no installation media. So that's a problem. So the only way that we see to kind of get around that is to potentially leverage things like alumni networks at major institutions for people that have gone off, like at Yale, for example. I'll give you an example. So the people that started Autodesk are Yale alums. And so there's opportunities there. There are networks, there are relationships to leverage that I don't know have been fully explored. So that's a big first step. It's just figuring out who does everyone know, right? But I would also say that, again, just to hit on these, license negotiation is another possible approach where at an institutional level where you have sort of, you can leverage your buying power for all of your departments, where you, especially in the software as a service model, where you negotiate some sort of alternative licensing agreement for that software once it enters into a zone where the archives are registering that they're seeing a large influx of proprietary file formats created with that piece of software. So that's engaging general counsel at university institutions and also engaging with software representative partners. And then as far as we're placed in the broader landscape, again, so we're anchored to history, that 30-year dialogue that's just been ongoing. You know, we're sort of just picking up where others have left off and building on their work. And then as we're calling ourselves Software Preservation Network, and I say that in part because I do believe that there will be a technical implementation that instead of creating yet another digital preservation network separate from DEEPIN and all of these other ongoing national projects, we're just sort of building this, I don't know if you want to call it functionality or maybe advocacy arm or policy arm on top of those existing networks. And so for project partners, all of Executable Archive, this is a virtualization as a service platform that was generated in partnership with IBM and Carnegie Mellon University. There's also BWFLA, which is a research project out of a German university, which is an emulation as a service platform. But the problem with all of these newer access platforms is that they rely on having licenses to the software that needs to be run in that environment. So there you go. There's also this thing that isn't as cool. I mean, it's cool, but it's not exactly what it sounds like in the context of what we've been talking about, which is the National Software Reference Library. And this is underneath the National Institute for Standards and Technology. What it is it's essentially a data set for criminal digital forensic specialists. So they do take software, like they house it, it is a reference library, but the reference part is they create checksums for all that software, and then the checksums are the data set that's released to the public. So that when you're doing a digital forensic investigation, so if someone changed the file extension on a file in order to hide its contents, you can say, oh, is this an exe? Well, I can check it against the checksum for, same named program. But Stanford, Henry Lowood, who's been involved in this project, software preservation more broadly from the very beginning, he is on our advisory committee along with the archivist at Microsoft, so we're hoping that end will do something for us, we'll see. And Carlos, I don't know if you guys are aware, has moved on from working at the university, although still a doc student, to being a technical advisor at Microsoft. So again, leveraging those social networks to see how far we can get in dialogue with software reps. And we have some strategies for how we sell that argument, but we can talk about that later. And then finally, the status report is basically we are turning in a grant now, literally right now, working on getting it through our institutional bureaucracy. And the next step after that, well, the planning grant will be to get people to sign on as being a member of this network so that we can then make the argument that it's ready for implementation, we'll have a bigger budget, and then the ultimate goal is always and should always be to find a membership model that allows you to sustain that project far beyond its grant term. And then here are my questions for you guys. So, but you can think about them. You don't have to answer them all right now. But anyway, okay.
So we'll move into Q&A because I'm really curious what the questions are. About half an hour or so. And if you've come to one of these meetups before, you know we're pretty informal about it. Just generally courtesy, like raise your hand and I'll kind of moderate, like, hey, go for it. And you can ask questions to our speakers or to anyone else in the room and just kind of get the dialogue going. So, well, first off, again, thank you to both of you all. I'm really glad to have you all here. I was familiar-ish with some of this, but I've learned a ton tonight too. It's crazy how much there is to this. So yeah, let's open it up. What you got?
So one of the things that caught my eye about your talk was the notion of the balancing act between providing access and maintaining integrity, and that's straight up encryption stuff sometimes, right? So especially with distributed nodes, and you have these regimes out there who might be very interested in change, like the winners write the history books, rewrite the history books potentially. So the integrity of public information. Have you, either of you, had to deal with this problem? What have you seen, etc.? Did the question make sense?
So I think one way to answer that question is to talk about where the profession is at in terms of providing access to Born Digital manuscript materials. Because Born Digital is big. There are projects that are created to be made accessible immediately, like let's say a digital oral history project, and then there are manuscript collections. Right. So Jen, I don't know.
I mean, I'm not sure. I haven't dealt with that particularly. I know there's, okay, so here, I know there are some projects, including our UT's Human Rights Documentation Initiative, that deals with very politically sensitive material, right? And so yes, in that case, one of their main collections has to do with the genocide in Rwanda and documenting what happened there. And so, we mirror that material here in case, somebody doesn't want that material around anymore.
Would you check somebody against the original every once in a while? And...
I think we may just host it general. I mean, we preserve our stuff, yes, and write it to tape and have things, checked with checksums. But I think as far as other people getting their hands on stuff, yeah. But the kinds of material that we have is often not of the present, and so it's a little bit different who's going after it, right? But yeah, I think it tends to be more archives are usually more impacted by massive governmental changes than than really, I don't think we think about hackers that much and that kind of thing, of people really trying to get the information that's in there right now. In the moment, but I'm not sure if that's
well. In terms of things like social security numbers,
sure,
health information. So if you gave me your hard drive, it would have all that stuff on there, right?
Right.
So then how do we deal with that in a way that scales? Okay, so if we're dealing with paper records, we're literally going through and redacting that information with a marker and making a photocopy and putting it in the box.
Yeah.
Well, if you give me like a 2 terabyte hard drive, no, just no.
But somebody got to you.
Yeah, but what do we do? First of all, we would never put anything in the cloud, okay, with a replicating node, regardless of who it's affiliated with, right? It's institutions, even if they're research institutions contributing to this thing, and there's no, we would never do that unless we had gone through and applied our scalable redaction tools, which are essentially like regular expressions. This is Big Curator, again, to go back to Big Curator, being this distribution, this rolled up package of open source digital forensics tools. One of the tools that it uses is this thing called bulk extractor. And you can point it at a series of files or a disk image. And you can give it regular expressions, but it also knows to look for certain things already. Email addresses, IP addresses, social security numbers, credit card numbers, all that kind of stuff. But you never know if it gets all of them or how many are false positives or, right. So we're a long way off as a profession from putting born digital manuscript material that we don't have a full intellectual control over into a system like that. But digitized materials, there's a lot of control in that situation. And so it's kind of that's a different scenario, but yeah.
So, what's the deal with Salman Rushdie?
Yeah, well, y'all should definitely check it out. But it's literally, you go into the reading room at Emory, and there's a computer workstation in the back, and it's like, this is Salman Rushdie's computer. But what they've done is they spent months and months literally going through, having multiple conversations with him, and they scrubbed what they were originally given, so that you're not going to go in there and find anything that could potentially get him killed. Although, arguably,
That's something different. By scrubbed, I thought you meant like they just don't do the emulation anymore.
Oh, no, that's still available.
Okay, yeah, no,
that's
yes.
Although what they did scrub of that project, to go back to scalability, is one thing people say is like emulation doesn't scale because you're doing it like on a case-by-case basis, and that's why when I bring up these like emulation as a service platforms, proof of concept is already out there. Yale has already implemented it, but now we're faced with this idea of like, well, let's see, emulation doesn't work unless we have that software we can open it up in. So that's where we're at. And but you should check out the Rushdie workstation. And there's multiple reports where they talk about all the resources that they had to invest to make that happen. And that's why I think there's a lot of rhetoric in our profession about emulation doesn't scale. But it will eventually.
Better AI.
And some software licenses, please.
Go for it.
Well, and along those lines, have you heard of or are you working with the Olive Executable Archive? Vince Cerf recently talked about they're creating a state machine, a virtual machine around the thing they're trying to preserve. Instead of trying to run the material on an emulator that's supposed to run other things too, it's basically just the content plus
It's like,
the state.
you make a little box for it.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting approach.
Yeah, no.
I mean, it's not scalable, but it's in a different way. It's like you're saving the little nuggets.
Right.
You're not really expecting to, you know.
Well, that brings up an interesting question too, which is, so the EU, they have this program called JISC. I think it used to be called like Digital Preservation Research Initiative or something, but it's a well-funded research program where in the later 2000s, well, before up to 2010, so 2008, 9, and 10, this guy named Matthews was responsible for looking into software preservation as a research project. How do we do that? What's the best way to do that? And that language is really focused on significant properties. What are the significant properties? And I guess like I feel like it's not mutually exclusive. It's not like, well, you have scalable emulation or scalable virtualization, or you just focus on significant properties and you just know that you're going to lose like 50% of what the other person next to you says is a significant property. But I don't think they're mutually exclusive, but I do think that the conversation tends to break down that way, where it's like either you have to pick the stuff that's important, which is entirely subjective, or you can't do it. And I think we've gotten past that.
Well, or you save it all. You know, you save as much.
Yeah, or you save it all, which
like the Internet Archive, which actually I was able to tour there last year, and they're scanning everything, whether they have secured rights for it or not. If they haven't secured rights, they're just stowing it. They own a copy, it's backed up. They'll never provide access, but they have the copy.
Yeah.
It's forward thinking.
I think
What's it?
Just like in the city.
Yeah, well,
And Jason Scott.
yeah, I mean, the save it all approach is interesting. I think that you always run up against, at least for our institutions, the Internet Archive may just have like unending love and admiration that flows in the form of money, but which I do have love and admiration for the Internet Archive, and they're one of our project partners. So, and I've talked to Jason Scott about this, and he's been doing, you know, the historical software collection is part of the Internet Archive now. You guys may have seen the JSMS emulator. Browser-based simulator, you can play those games, right? But you can't take, like, say, a file that you have that you need to read and drag and drop it into your web browser and be able to go in there and make meaning from it. But not yet. Yeah, that's right. So, but as institutionally, we're kind of running up against the reality of it costs so much to produce digitized versions of analog materials that need to be preserved. Right, because those
in terms of staff time.
In terms of staff time and storage. So if you think about it, an archival master or a preservation master can be like an 185 megabyte file. I mean, that's huge when you're talking about upwards of 200,000 files. And in addition to that, what we're seeing for Born Digital accessions is it's not a floppy disk anymore. It's like 500 gigs. A terabyte, 2 terabyte hard drive. And we do have ways to create disk images that provide lossless compression, but there's a lot of overhead in like decoding and encoding that compression algorithm. So something can always go wrong in the process of doing that.
And there's the metadata issue, which is with Born Digital, a lot of times you can extract, and we're finding new ways to extract a lot of the metadata that we would need, but with digitized stuff, you have to have a human doing that most of the time.
So
applying metadata to it so that you can ever find
I'm curious about that then. Like, it sounds like you talked about like reinventing wheels earlier and how you'll try to avoid that. It seems like a lot of the, you were showing the like DeepN is kind of a sharding, like database sharding kind of a thing, duplication, and the whole lossless compression thing. These are like issues that the cloud companies seem to be working actively on, or
so that's
Amazon,
a really
Google
interesting
have,
question, Stephen.
like solved.
They have a different motive too.
But they do.
Yeah.
They have a lot more money behind them. So are y'all working with these?
So
companies,
this is an interesting question because underlying some of these. So I don't know if you guys know about DuraCloud or like the DuraSpace, which is a nonprofit. They produce Fedora Commons, which is a DAMS asset management framework. That was used at the Google Computer Museum. Yes. And so anyways. What was, yes. But so DuraSpace, they just recently started providing digital preservation, storage, and so they have a middleware layer that's their digital preservation middleware, but underneath that is Amazon Web Services. So, and that's what we're running into with universities too, is I think that even though we still have supercomputing centers like TAC where it's local, it's big, right? I think that the era of the supercomputer is maybe on its way out. And so, not that it's happening anytime soon, but I think it may be on its way out, and I think that it's a little bit scary to see this pattern and also to be in meetings, and Jennifer, you can speak to this, but it's like, well, it's inevitable. It's inevitable. Everyone's just going to move to Amazon Web Services, and it's like, right, well, what about like a plan of succession for imminent business failure, or, like, what about my deed of gift that has
It's
to be
very
piped through general
affordable.
counsel? Yeah, that has to be piped through general counsel to change the fact that I need to make my donors aware that their material will be stored by a third party.
Oh
A
boy.
corporation.
Yeah.
So there's lots of issues there. Yeah, that's a really, that's good.
And and that, like you brought up, the profit motive, there are a lot of issues that we have that we would love to be solving ourselves. But the fact is, and libraries have this with publishing companies too. They have a profit motive to solve a number of problems that libraries would like to be solving and supplying services for, but yeah, they've got the profit motive, and they can make their people work 80 hours a week, which you can't do for the state, and et cetera. So hence the partnerships. But yeah,
We're getting to
it would be a bummer if they solve
Kevin and
their
then-
problems with our problems with their recommendations and reasons.
Oh yeah. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, so I was very struck by the issue of just the proprietary file formats, because it really, I work in programming, you really can create kind of any file system of encoding information you want. It's literally infinite. It's whatever makes sense for you. The problem, there's no standards, and even if there were, somebody can just create a new one. And so it seems like just if you're always trying to, have a complete list of everyone and programs to read everyone, it's a problem that will never be solved because it grows faster than you can possibly contain it. I'm curious, are there any efforts to create software or algorithms to create intelligent programs that can look at just a data file and figure out what the humans encoded?
Are people building robot archivists?
So that's a really interesting question, and I think that the challenge that we're looking at now is it's hard to take the expertise that you're coming from when you ask that question and get it into the archives. Do you see what I'm saying? Because again, to go back to paying rent and feeding yourself and doing things like that, people with those kinds of skills, although that's not to say that those skills cannot be embodied in a potential project partner. So maybe that's the direction that we need to push that dialogue. So I appreciate that, but also to say that I have a question back, which has to do more with, so I understand, if we take a proprietary file format that's like a text, but it's pretty much text-based.
Yes.
I could read or I could discern some of the content from looking at it in a hex editor. I don't need WordPerfect 3.0 or whatever.
Right.
But my question is, when we get into to use an example of the CAD file, that's where I'm wondering, to what extent do we actually need all those proprietary features? What are we losing when we're building something that can discern meaning from the file, but not necessarily render in its entirety? So I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, just because going also off some of my background, just thinking about information theory in general, because I also, my degree is bioengineering of all things, but I think about the problem of trying to solve the protein folding problem, which is one of the big holy grails in biological sciences. But one thing you learn about proteins is that they kind of sort of form entropy valleys where they kind of flow to the point. And I would be curious if when humans create digital encoding schemes, if maybe data just follows a similar thing where you can almost sort of look at entropy valleys in the data. And
I bet Wolfram is working on it actively.
Maybe it seems to me, that would be what I would try if I decided to change careers suddenly, but it seems like it might be possible.
I'm curious, actually, have you all worked with the Wolfram company at all? He seems to be mega maniacally working toward solving these sorts of problems.
It's going to prove we're all computer games.
Yeah, Wolfram Alpha as a meta.
They make Mathematica,
metadata
right?
process. Yeah.
Yes.
All that.
Well, and actually, if you ask Siri, well, you can go, Wolfram Alpha. What airlines are flying above me now?
Whenever you ask
Wolfram
Siri in
Alpha
that
to seek them out. That example's not going to work. I'm confusing it. But anyway.
Did you have a question still?
Yeah, it was kind of on that last topic about, you said partnerships with the companies with the data. I'm just kind of curious, what's going to what is the idea?
What's the motivator for them to participate?
Yeah, exactly. I work for a computer literacy nonprofit, and Google, Microsoft are coming right at us because
Right.
they want
Yeah.
us to teach them.
Well, you bring up a really great point. They're coming at you because of what? Corporate responsibility initiatives.
And when they're going to get first-time users that they're interested
Right,
in
also
computers.
true.
Oh,
Also
pipelining developers in for their whole lives
Yeah.
and stuff.
Yeah,
Or,
I mean, that's the
sorry,
same
future
reason why
consumers.
Apple came into all the university campuses and why we still have a legacy relationship to Apple at the University of Texas. But to get back to your point, yeah, it's a really hard question to answer. And I think that there's two things that I can sort of think of. One is, right now, not that this matters to them because it's like the cost of doing business, but I don't know how advantageous it is to solve this problem on an ad hoc basis. So like, you know, every time there's a rulemaking procedure, like we'll make the decision separately for that case that time. And then it's sort of with each new question, like ESA versus, you know, EFF, like, okay, now we're talking about video games and we're talking about this specific set of video games, massive multiplayer online games. We're talking about what are the significant properties, and they're arguing that it's online, that it's internet-based, and we're arguing, well, no, I mean, like, it has other properties besides the fact that there's like this multiplayer action going on that's online. So I would say that it seems like it would be advantageous to negotiate either an alternative licensing schema that kind of is a blanket solution. So I kind of see that as one tack. And the other tack is to go back to corporate responsibility and its sort of how it's risen in visibility in terms of now you have people that are like, corporate responsibility is not just what we do because we have to. It's like a core fundamental value that helps us to build our roadmap for where we're growing. And at least that is like the Harvard Business Review rhetoric surrounding corporate responsibility initiatives. So if we can take that rhetoric and like mirror that back, I don't
You see
know.
that active in similar areas, or that sort of philosophy or that sort of approach?
I don't know what other areas that's been applied in. That's a good question.
You can walk the talk.
And I would say, from my perspective, this is one reason that I go around and give talks to people, is that I just think there are people out there who don't want to write algorithms to make other people rich, but that are curious people who are humans and care about the cultural record, and that maybe we can get some of those brilliant minds working on our problems, because I think they're really interesting problems, you know. So I think sometimes it's just a personal thing that maybe you don't get the corporation on board, but you get one person at that company interested in thinking that it's worthwhile, and then you can develop something, you know, and maybe that turns into their, you know, nonprofit branch or whatever, but like you can hook.
But definitely acknowledging that like altruism, like we totally get it. It's a super hard problem, and altruism is not going to be like the magic carpet that we float on, you know, through this issue. But yeah, we don't have all the answers for the best way to take what the messaging that they're giving us and mirror it back to them. But I feel like that's at least one way we might be able to strategize around that.
But if you find a use case that's of interest as well, like resilient archives, long-term preservation of mission-critical material, even genetic information, endangered species data, then, and that stuff is my interest, then you may be able to coax out what an ideal system looks like and actually paint some pictures of that ideal system that have elements that they hadn't considered. The longevity of the formats. You know, you can distribute things all you want, but if the formats continue to degrade, you know,
that's true. And there's certainly right. And you bring up a good point, which is I glossed over a lot of stuff, but like part of the network is contributing to a research program, so that's layered on top of just okay, we're going to make disk images, and we're going to create technical metadata, and we're going to try to implement these emulation as service platforms, or at least provide secure plugins where institutions can, you know, go to wherever their disk image is stored for the license they purchased, or some other means through some alternative licensing agreement. But yes, I mean, what you said.
You gotta have common ground.
Yes.
And if the common ground includes things that
What's
may not
actually,
be in there,
what data is actually
6 months,
interesting to them.
profit interest, you might get somewhere.
More. Yeah, someone we haven't heard from yet, sorry.
Oh, I just had a question. I remember I didn't get to come to the last meeting about, I think it was police body cameras, but I I listened to, there was a great NPR, I don't know if it was NPR, but it was public radio, report on police body cameras, and it focused, the end of it focused on the archiving issue. And I wondered if we talked about that here already today or last month, because they've got, like, Taser has a website called evidence.com, and it's a corporate service that they tell the police officers, we're here to protect you, and we manage the archives of all of these hours, millions of hours of body camera footage.
What could possibly go wrong?
This just sounds like a
Great
idea.
But that's also true for quantified self-tracking. So all the medical technology, the whole Internet of Things that we've got going on surrounding our health and the need and our requirement for competing with another person in order to go take a walk for 20 minutes, but whatever you have to do. But it's that is a big problem, because that's not data we're getting, that's being directly uploaded to whoever the service provider is.
Yeah, we're the product essentially.
Well,
Yeah.
and also I would just throw out too that as archives get more into this realm, I anticipate there being some issues where an archive doesn't handle something properly because they're not well versed in what to do with some digital collection, right? And I haven't seen anything like that yet, but I would definitely be curious to look for that too, to see this getting beyond our means sometimes. Depending on the archive, if some place that's not qualified takes some material and then mismanages it.
But that's another reason.
That would be really interesting to see, because it does happen with archives with analog material from time to time. It's rare, but there was a big dust up at University of Oregon recently
But that's
student
also,
records, and that could very easily happen.
That's also why it's
that was
worth,
digital action.
yeah, and that's also why it's worth bringing up what Jennifer said in her presentation about you have a collecting strategy, right? Not every institution collects the same thing. I mean, the difference between, one of the differences, I think, significant differences between libraries and archives, and correct me if I'm wrong, is in libraries, although they do oftentimes have special collections, but libraries deal with published materials or non-unique materials. And then repositories often deal with unique materials, although sometimes those have also been published, so we get an iteration of the final product. But as far as that goes, you have something called, or you should have if you're a collecting institution, called a collection development policy. And what you find is there are already institutions that are going to go really hard in this direction because that's part of what they want to focus on in their collection development policy. Whereas there are going to be other institutions that just cannot participate or cannot contribute and are kind of going to wait for that work to be done. And that's how it always is and how it's always been.
So those institutions in the latter case might collect materials but not be able to access them because they didn't as heavily, or not be able to do the same kinds of preservation that
well, what they'll be waiting on is what a lot of people had been waiting on with the development of Big Curator, right? Out of UNC Chapel Hill and also University of Maryland, was like, if we just have these tools, we've got stuff, but they're waiting, and it happened. Well, and so it's kind of...
And it's real recent that we're getting these tools. I mean, as recently as, 2009, I was working on the Norman Mailer papers and at the Harry Ransom Center. At that point, what I did as an archivist when I came to a floppy disk was write one floppy disk, put it in the folder, and put it in a box, because that's what we could do, Wow. And we had just hired somebody who was like our first digital print. She was working with the Michael Joyce hypertext archive, and that's where we started, and now I'm sure they do something very different with floppy disks at the Ransom Center, but that wasn't very, very long ago at all, that it just wasn't even anything I thought about at all.
If you guys are interested in
there are plenty of archives still operating like that and just putting their stuff on a shelf and waiting until they have the expertise or the skill, the technology or whatever it is,
But Jen brings up an interesting point, which is if you guys are more interested in how open source digital forensics tools came into special collections or archival repositories, there's a CLEAR report that stands for Council on Library and Information Resources. It was published actually in 2009 with the Digital Archivist at the HRC, Matt Kirschenbaum, who's a faculty member at the University of Maryland School of Information, and a couple of other people. But it's called Digital Forensics in Cultural Heritage Institutions. So, and I think it's available for free online on the CLEAR website. So if you guys are interested in that, you should definitely check it out.
More questions. We have a little bit of time here, so.
Can I just follow really quick on what you were saying, the creepy taser stuff? Just because I had this really creepy moment that would be of interest to this group, I think. And it was a linked open data training that I went to in conjunction with a conference a couple weeks ago. And so it was using this tool called Karma to apply linked data to your data set, right? And so for us, we're talking about like our catalog information and how to link names together and places and things like that, right? But the guy who was doing the training is a data scientist from somewhere, and he does work against sex trafficking, like to prevent sex trafficking, which yay. But also I happen to know some people who are in the sex worker industry, and a lot of people get scooped up in that law enforcement action who are doing legal work here in the United States, and who the last freaking thing they need is the cops breathing down their necks. And a lot of that work is done by scraping escort ads, like thousands and thousands and thousands of them off the internet, and then doing all kinds of data, processing and analysis, and then there are companies that do that and sell that to the law enforcement. And so, so I tweeted a picture of this screenshot of data that he had up, and all of a sudden I started getting all these text messages, and this friend of mine saying, you need to ask him some hard questions right now. What company does he work for? And, I played it cool in the thing because it was all my coworkers. That's not what he was there talking about, but yeah, I mean, there's
so like the lines
overlap
quite a bit.
Yeah.
I mean, now that everything is sort of in the digital realm, in cyberspace, like it's harder to delineate kind of, okay, this is in the archive now, and like the sources and the linkages between them.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. That's why she was showing what is a continuum rather
Yes.
than a life cycle. There's no end, it just gets reused, yeah.
Well, and that's another challenge that we're having is we can't just put it in a place and preserve it forever. You have to do the access thing, but then also reuse. Like there's a lot of stuff that can be reused. Physical archives get reused, but you have to take a photo and send it to a printer.
So I have a question about that kind of the continual process of it and the evolution of the data formats. We've touched on it a few times, but like the software as a service and information as a service and the kind of detachment from our physical computers of all of these processes, it really complicates the preservation of the performativity, right? Like you're really talking about then this thing exists in a web, literally on the web, and how can you preserve more and more, how can you preserve any of the significant factors of it after a certain point?
Well, this is one reason, I mean, the software as a service thing is the primary motivation for talking to the industry. Because basically, there is no way we can get access to previous versions, because whatever your service is the most recent version.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, there's just no way around that problem. We have to talk about it. Even if we get told, like, hell no, not just no, but hell no. I mean, like, at least initially, we have to say, look, we get it, fine, whatever, floppy disk, optical media installation, installation media, got licensing issues there, but we're entering into this whole new realm. We won't have access to the versions that was used to create this thing.
Mm-hmm.
So,
They could give it to you if they wanted to.
right, well that's the thing, we gotta figure out how to couch it in terms that's meaningful for them, that's right.
They just don't have it.
Crazy. Let's do 3 more questions.
I actually wanted to chain off. Something you said a minute ago about, just like, it got me thinking about, like, as far as privacy on the West. So the definition of, like, in the real world, we have an idea of a public versus a private space. And I'm kind of curious, like, I don't know, I realize I don't know as much as I should about where we formally stand as far as legal definitions of public versus private space. Is it like a private space if it's behind a username and password? Is it a private space if it's not indexed by the DNS? Like, where does that
I think we could scope that from our perspective, which is, to a certain extent, it's what we go after and it's what people bring to us, right? So like, that's where, and the conversation doesn't end there. It's not like, okay, here's my hard drive, do whatever you want with it. No, we sit down and we're like, full disclosure, this is what a disk image means. It means we get whatever is in your trash. So that little flag that the computer like writes to that file to say it's in the trash, it still exists.
Right.
We can still recover it. So, you know, you should be aware of that, because there's this other thing called a logical copy where you could just pre-curate the stuff that you want to have in your collection and hand that over to us. So yeah, I think as far as our institutions are concerned, we could say it's through that conversation that we determine what is private for a while and how long that while is, and then when it becomes public, which is the eventual goal.
But the companies aren't concerned with, you know, the company owns your password and your username if you sign the
Well, yeah, you read the fine print that none of us ever read.
But the key there is they're actually not, the other side of the scale is they're not concerned with the longevity. You know, they're concerned with if it's driving profit right now, by the time that changes, we will change what part of you we own. So there is an area that's ripe for research. And I think one of the big breakthroughs will be in storage capacity. Because we're in a moment of, you know, I guess, you talk about we're in a moment of biodiversity that is fading. We may be in a moment of mimetic diversity that over time, you know, may fade as well. But if you can capture massive amounts of that, not worry about parsing it until you have the means to do so, then you've bought yourself some time, or you've bought the future some time. One of the media formats I'm most interested in is digital DNA storage. The Weiss Institute at Harvard has worked on methods to encode digital data in DNA simply by assigning every adenine and cytosine as a 1 and every thymine and guanine as a 0, and synthesizing it. And in order to read it, that's like a tape drive. To read it back,
right?
You sequence it. Yeah, but it's 10 million copies of Shakespeare. So the storage capacity at this point is 1 zettabyte per ounce. I believe so. A zettabyte.
So I can have like a garden that's just like,
zettabyte
with the Internet Archive like placed into a
I think like on the planet they say 11 zettabytes of information exist currently. So 11 ounces of liquid could contain the world's information. The point is, these media are slowly developing, and the means are there to begin to store on a massive scale. So in a way, that's going to drive, you know, all kinds of things.
Make it 12 ounces, you got a can.
What's that?
Make it 12 ounces, you got a can of Coke.
Make it 12 ounces, you got a can of Coke.
Boy, so that would be funny if like the next NSA data center is just like a massive field.
Yeah.
Just them actually growing things.
That's when you gotta build a biological computer at that point. It's a much more efficient data storage medium. It's so tiny in comparison.
Which is what we are.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Crazy. Well, that feels like a pretty good place to wrap it, actually. So we have one last treat for you before we'll go into just like, you know, mix and mingle. Mark Powell, poet extraordinaire from San Francisco. He's done, he will perform a poem of what we did here today.
Yeah, so, wow, really great. Thanks, Jeff and Jessica, for everything. I just took notes on everything and tried to distill parts of it. And tried to think about, I'm kind of the opposite of a cheerleader for technology, and I was trying to think about all these GeoCities pages where, you know, messed up 13-year-old suicide poetry I wrote is still preserved. Thank you, Jason Scott.
Yeah.
So maybe this is something to think about an opposite of that. Is all data sacred? Well, all the best software is dead, and these resurrectionists are digging up the graves of dead companies who made this dead software and sucking up the dead data with disk dump brain straws. But what about the creator's intent? What about my dead software? I want my data to die. I want my formats to be forgotten. I don't want my zine to be OCR'd, preserved by non-experts, not even from my scene. I want my clicks forgotten. I want to call the Tower of Babel. I want to smash the bricks into unrecoverable dust outside of the reach of these bored video game zombies, these soldiers trained in the war against forgetting, just clicking and clicking so that Google can get rich off of their total information dominance? But should we keep all photos forever? All tweets, all status updates? Should we let data die? Should data be immortal? Can we make that decision? Isn't there a biological cycle of life? If something is born, it should die. Should data be a continuum with no end? Why are we making something that is immortal? But you know what? Piracy is awesome. So piracy, even in the service of preservation, don't copy that floppy, don't scan that zine, don't bogart that cloud. Well, I don't like don't. I'm not down with don't, so I'm down with piracy. Let's break the laws, let's reverse the formats, let's take our data back out of the rigor mortis jaws of these dead companies, protected by these necromantic treaties. This freedom to remember might be a bad idea. The opposite of a memory hole. But preserving all these games, preserving all the Farmvilles, preserving all the angry birds so that future generations can waste their lives in sacred data worship, playing Grandpa's Angry Birds game back over and over. These ashes of creativity from us vacuumed into this corporate cloud, and oh, sacred cloud! Oh, sacred data! We fight for your immortality forever and ever. Our cryogenics have failed our bodies, so we've given up on preserving ourselves. There is no hex editor for humanity after all, and we put our hope in these data libraries, digital pogroms against the human experience, and books are burned, and Xerox machines are over, and these tools will be made, and these tools will shape us like bonsai prisons, and history will be consumed by karma, and history will be stuck dead in pure data form, and history becomes a foreign country, hosted in this corporate cloud, a complex digital object, dead and preserved, but at least it's not forgotten.
Thanks for coming, everybody. Follow us on meetup.com or EFF Austin on Twitter. And we're looking for folks to help us out, so talk to me and Greg and John. Have a good evening.